They say the sweetest revenge is living well, but they are wrong. True revenge is watching your enemy sign his own death warrant while believing it is a winning lottery ticket. Grant thought he could discard me like trash, never suspecting that for 5 years I had been designing his personal hell. When he finally screamed, it was not from pain, but from the terror of realizing his entire life had collapsed in one single second. My name is Brenda Hightower, and if you looked at me from across the candlelit dining room of the Gilded Cage that evening, you would have seen a portrait of absolute composure. I sat with my back perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the starch-stiffened linen tablecloth, wearing a navy silk gown that whispered money without needing to scream it. At 42 years old, I had mastered the art of taking up space while remaining entirely still. To the casual observer, I was the dutiful wife of Boston's latest tech darling, the quiet support system behind the genius. But if you looked closer, if you dared to stare directly into my eyes, you would have seen something else entirely. You would have seen the cold, predatory calculation of a woman watching a fly land on the trigger of a mousetrap. The Gilded Cage was exactly the sort of place Grant loved. It was an institution in Boston, a restaurant where the walls were lined with mahogany so dark it looked like dried blood, and the chandeliers were heavy enough to kill a man if the ceiling ever gave way. It was exclusive, pretentious, and suffocating, a perfect metaphor for my marriage. We were there to celebrate our daughter, Maya, graduating from high school with honors, but everyone in the room knew the real guest of honor was Grant's ego. Grant Sterling sat at the head of the table. Naturally, at 45, he was in his prime, or so the magazines kept telling him. He was handsome in that generic, polished way that CEOs of biotech firms are supposed to be. His suit was Italian, bespoke, and cost more than most people's cars. He was currently holding court, gesturing with a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon as he regaled the table with a story they had all heard 3 times before. "The thing about innovation," Grant said, his voice projecting just loud enough to be heard by the neighboring tables, "is that you have to be willing to break things. You have to be willing to look at the status quo and say, 'Not good enough.'" "Right, Brenda." I opened my mouth to speak, to offer a polite agreement. But Grant did not wait for an answer. He never did. "Brenda worries about the details," he continued, flashing a patronizing smile at me that didn't reach his eyes. He turned his attention back to Senator Miller, who was seated to his right. "She is the cautious one, always looking at the safety rails. But at Etheria Dynamics, we don't believe in safety rails. We believe in flying." The table chuckled politely. It was a collection of Boston's elite partners from law firms, venture capitalists, and social climbers who would sell their own kidneys for a seat at this table. They laughed because Grant was rich, and because Etheria Dynamics was rumored to be going public soon, and they all wanted a piece of the pie. They looked at me with pity masked as admiration. Poor Brenda, so lucky to be married to a visionary, even if she is a bit dull. I took a small sip of my water. The ice was melting. I felt a hand grip mine under the table. It was tight, the knuckles hard against my palm. I turned slightly to look at Maya. My daughter looked beautiful in her white graduation dress, but her face was pale. She was 18 years old today, legally an adult, but in that moment, she looked like a terrified child. She knew. Children always know when the air pressure in a house changes, long before the storm hits. Maya had spent the last year watching her father drift away, watching him snap at me over breakfast, watching him come home late smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't mine. She squeezed my hand again, her eyes darting toward the end of the table. "It is going to be fine." I tapped on her hand in Morse code. It was a game we had played since she was 5. Maya relaxed slightly, though her jaw remained set. She did not trust him. She was smart. She was my daughter. After all, my gaze drifted to the far end of the table, where Vanessa sat. Vanessa was the newly appointed Director of Strategy at Etheria. She was 28, sharp-featured, and hungry. She was wearing a dress that was a shade of red too aggressive for a family celebration, and she wasn't eating. She was watching Grant with a proprietary look that made my stomach turn not out of jealousy, but out of disgust for her lack of subtlety. She caught my eye and held it. There was a smirk playing on her lips. A challenge. She thought she had won. She thought she was the upgrade. A waiter appeared at my elbow to refill my wine glass. I covered the rim with my hand. "No, thank you," I said softly. "I want to keep a clear head." Grant heard me. He laughed, a booming sound that made the silverware rattle. "Oh, let loose a little. Brenda, it is a celebration. Try to have some fun for once. You are always so serious. It sucks the energy right out of the room." The insult was wrapped in a joke, but the blade was sharp. The guests shifted uncomfortably. This was Grant's favorite game, the public diminishing of his wife. He needed to paint me as the bore, the anchor dragging down his magnificent ship, so that when he finally cut the rope, he would look like the victim seeking freedom. "I am having a wonderful time, Grant," I said, my voice even. "I am just proud of Maya." "We are all proud of Maya," Grant said dismissively, not even looking at our daughter. "But let us be honest, her success is a testament to good genes." He winked at the senator. Vanessa giggled. It was a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. "Grant is so modest," she purred. "He has been working so hard on the new merger. He practically lives at the office." "Yes," I said, locking eyes with her. "He certainly spends a lot of time strategizing." Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. But Grant was too absorbed in his own reflection in the spoon to notice the tension. He checked his watch, a platinum monstrosity that I had bought him for our 20th anniversary. He tapped his spoon against his champagne glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound cut through the murmurs of the restaurant. Heads turned. This was it. The moment the entire room had been anticipating. The rumor mill had been churning for weeks that Grant was going to announce the IPO date tonight. The investors at the table leaned in, their eyes gleaming with greed. Grant stood up. He adjusted his silk tie and buttoned his jacket. He looked commanding. He looked powerful. He looked like a man who believed he was untouchable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant began, his voice dropping an octave to that serious CEO register he had practiced in front of the mirror. "Thank you for joining us tonight. We are here, ostensibly, to celebrate Maya's graduation. And yes, Maya, good job. High school is over. Now the real world begins." He gestured vaguely in Maya's direction but didn't make eye contact. Maya stiffened beside me. I moved my thumb over her hand, stroking her skin soothingly. "Wait," I thought, "just wait." "But," Grant continued, his voice rising, "standing here tonight, surrounded by friends, partners, and the future leaders of Boston, I realize that life is about evolution. It is about growth. Etheria Dynamics is about to take a quantum leap forward. We are on the verge of changing the world." The table nodded. This was the IPO speech. However, Grant paused for dramatic effect. He loved pauses. "You cannot lead a revolution in the marketplace if you are living a lie in your personal life. A man cannot soar if he is tethered to the ground." The room went deadly silent. The smile on Senator Miller's face froze. This was not the IPO speech. Grant turned to look at me. His expression was devoid of affection, devoid of the 20 years of history we shared, devoid of the memory of me nursing him through his burnout in his 30s. He looked at me as if I were a piece of office furniture he had decided to liquidate. "Brenda and I," Grant said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "have been on different paths for a long time. I have evolved. I have grown. And I need a partner who can run at my pace, someone who understands the future, not someone who is constantly trying to drag me back into the past." I did not blink. I did not gasp. I saw Maya start to rise, her face flushing with anger. But I clamped my hand down on hers, anchoring her to the chair. Not yet. My eyes told her, let him finish. Grant extended a hand toward the end of the table. "Vanessa is not just my director of strategy. She is my partner in every sense of the word. She is the future of Etheria. and she is my future. Brenda and I will be separating, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the room. It was scandalous. It was tacky. It was brutal. To do this at his daughter's graduation dinner, in front of half of Boston's high society, it was the act of a narcissist who was so convinced of his own magnificence that he thought he could spin adultery as an act of courageous leadership. Vanessa stood up, beaming. She walked over to Grant, her hips swaying. He put an arm around her waist and pulled her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, looking at me with triumph. She flashed a diamond ring on her finger, a ring that was definitely not an engagement ring, but was flashy enough to signal ownership. I recognized the cut. It was a 3-carat cushion cut. I also knew exactly which company account had paid for it. "I know this is a shock," Grant said, his tone oozing fake sympathy. "But I wanted to be transparent. I want to live my truth. Maya, you are an adult now. You understand that your father has a right to be happy. True happiness is rare, and when you find it, you have to seize it." The audacity was breathtaking. He was framing his midlife crisis and his affair as a noble quest for happiness. He was destroying our family and expecting applause. I looked down at my watch. It was 8:15 in the evening. 0 hour. Everything was in place. The servers were primed. The emails were queued. The trap door under his feet had been unlatched. He just hadn't looked down yet. Grant raised his glass again. "So, I would like to propose a toast. To the future, to Etheria, and to new beginnings." The guests were paralyzed. No one knew what to do. Toast to the destruction of a marriage. Ignore the crying daughter. They looked at me, waiting for the reaction. Was I going to cry? Was I going to scream? Was I going to throw my wine in his face? I slowly pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the parquet floor with a harsh sound that cut through the awkward silence. I stood up. I smoothed the silk of my dress. I picked up my glass of red wine, a 1995 Chateau Margaux that cost $1,200 a bottle. I swirled the liquid gently. "Brenda," Grant said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "do not make a scene. Let us handle this with dignity. Don't be pathetic." I looked at him. I really looked at him. I saw the fear behind his arrogance. He was afraid I would cry. He was afraid I would beg. He wanted me to be the hysterical, abandoned housewife so he could be the long-suffering husband who had no choice but to leave. I walked around the table. The click of my heels was steady, rhythmic. I stopped 3 feet away from him and Vanessa. The perfume Vanessa wore was cloying gardenias and ambition. "Dignity," I repeated, my voice calm, clear, and carrying to the back of the room. That is an interesting word coming from a man who just announced his adultery at his daughter's graduation dinner. "It is not adultery if the marriage is dead," Grant snapped, his facade slipping. "And do not ruin this for Maya. Sit down, Brenda." "Oh, I am not ruining anything, Grant," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "I agree with you. Tonight is about the future. It is about the truth. You said you wanted to be transparent." I reached into my clutch. Grant flinched, perhaps thinking I had a weapon. In a way, I did, but it wasn't a gun. "You have redefined happiness," I said, holding his gaze. "You think you have discarded a burden. You think you are standing on the summit of the world, about to ascend to the gods." I looked at the guests. Grant thinks he has just announced his freedom. But there is one small detail he forgot, one variable he failed to account for in his grand strategy. I turned back to him. The predator was no longer hiding. "You forgot who built the ground you are standing on, Grant. You forgot that while you were busy strategizing with Vanessa, someone had to actually run the company." Grant laughed nervously. "She is delusional. The shock has been too much for her. Someone get her a glass of water." "I do not need water," I said, "and I do not need your pity." I checked my watch one last time. 8:17. The file transfer I had scheduled 5 years ago. The dead man's switch. I had coded into the very heart of his empire. had just executed. You wanted a new beginning. Grant, I whispered, loud enough only for him, Vanessa, and the front row of stunned spectators to hear. I have prepared one for you, but I do not think it is the one you are expecting. Grant's smile faltered, for the first time all night. The arrogance flickered out, replaced by a dawn of confusion. He saw something in my eyes that he hadn't seen in 20 years. He didn't see his wife. He saw the mathematician. He saw the architect. He saw the woman who knew where all the bodies were buried because she was the one who had dug the graves. He opened his mouth to speak, but I turned away from him, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a servant. I looked at the projection screen that had been set up for a slideshow of Maya's childhood photos. If everyone could please direct their attention to the screen, I said, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a verdict. I have a small presentation of my own. Consider it a graduation gift. For everyone. Grant took a step toward me. Brenda, sit down. Now. But it was too late. I had already signaled the waiter I had bribed $2,000 to connect my iPad to the system. The screen flickered to life. The performance of the arrogant man was over. The execution was about to begin. As the pixels on the projection screen began to organize themselves into the familiar blue and silver logo of Etheria Dynamics, time seemed to suspend itself. The room was holding its breath, waiting to see what sort of sentimental montage a scorned wife would inflict upon them. They expected baby photos. They expected weeping. They expected the desperate flailing of a woman losing her provider. They did not know that they were looking at the architect. And Grant was merely the facade. To understand the magnitude of the execution that was about to take place, you have to understand the lie that Grant and I had lived for 2 decades, the narrative sold to Forbes, to Wall Street, and to the very guests sitting in this room was that Grant Sterling was a visionary genius. He was the golden boy of biotech who had revolutionized the way artificial intelligence mapped the human genome. I was just Brenda, the quiet, supportive wife who organized the charity galas and made sure his shirts were pressed. The narrative was neat. It was palatable. It fit the patriarchal fantasy of the brilliant man and his domestic anchor. But the reality was a sequence of zeros and ones that only I could read. I was never a debutante. I did not come from money, and I certainly did not marry Grant for his. When we met 22 years ago at MIT, Grant was a charming but mediocre business student who could not pass a basic calculus exam without a cheat sheet. I was a doctoral candidate in computational mathematics on a full scholarship, surviving on instant noodles and the adrenaline of solving problems that professors said were impossible. Etheria Dynamics did not spring from Grant's forehead like Athena. It was born on my laptop, a battered machine held together with duct tape. On a rainy Tuesday in November of 2001, I wrote the code. I designed the proprietary algorithm that became the company's crown jewel, the Genesis sequence. It was a piece of software so complex that it could predict genetic mutations with 99% accuracy. Grant did not understand the code. He could not write a single line of Python if his life depended on it. But Grant had a gift that I lacked entirely. He could walk into a room and make people believe that the impossible was inevitable. He could sell ice to a polar bear. He possessed a charisma that was almost weaponized. We made a deal, explicitly and verbally, sitting on the floor of our first cramped apartment. I remember the smell of stale pizza and the hum of the server tower I had built in the closet. I want to build things, Grant, I had told him. I want to solve the puzzle. I do not want to talk to investors. I do not want to go to board meetings or do interviews or wear uncomfortable shoes. I just want to code. Then let me be the shield, Grant had said, his eyes shining with ambition. I will handle the world. I will take the heat. You stay in the shadows and do the magic. We will be partners, 50-50, always. It was a seduction, but not a romantic one. It was a professional seduction. So, for 20 years, I kept my promise. I wrote every patent, but I put his name on the dotted line. I solved every crisis that threatened to sink the company. feeding him the technical solutions through an earpiece or a text message before he walked into a press conference. I let the world call him a genius while I sat in our home office. The true engine of Etheria, invisible and content. I sacrificed my ego for our family. I wanted a normal life for Maya. I did not want paparazzi chasing us. I wanted to be a mother who was there for breakfast and dinner, not a CEO sleeping on a private jet. It seemed like a fair trade. I had the peace, and he had the glory. But I was a programmer, and programmers are paranoid by nature. We know that systems fail. We know that hard drives crash. And we know that users lie. So, when I wrote the core source code for the Genesis sequence, the heartbeat of a company now valued at $3 billion, I did something out of habit. I built a backdoor. It was not malicious at the time. It was a standard developer tool, a way for me to access the system, push updates, or shut it down if we were hacked, bypassing all the administrative security protocols that Grant's team eventually installed. It was a hidden root access key that only existed in my head. Grant did not know it existed because he never bothered to look at the code. He wouldn't have understood it if he had. For years, the arrangement worked. But then, the rot set in. It is a subtle thing, watching a man start to believe his own press release. At first, Grant was grateful. He would come home, loosen his tie, and say, "We did it. Bren, you saved us." But somewhere around year 10, the we turned into I. He started to correct me on technical matters in private, repeating buzzwords he had learned from magazines as if they were gospel. He began to treat my contributions not as the foundation of the company, but as administrative tasks he had delegated. He forgot that he was the mask, and I was the face. He looked in the mirror and saw a titan of industry, and when he looked at me, he no longer saw his partner. He saw a middle-aged woman in yoga pants who nagged him about taking out the recycling. He saw a dependent. The only person who saw the truth was Maya. Maya was my masterpiece. More than any algorithm, she had my mind. By the time she was 12, she was solving college-level differential equations. We had a secret world, Maya and I, while Grant was out playing golf with senators. I was teaching Maya how to code in C++ and Rust. We would sit in the library, communicating in a shorthand of logic and syntax that Grant found baffling and boring. "Why do you teach her that nerd stuff?" Grant had sneered once. "She needs to learn how to network. That is where the real power is." Maya had looked up from her laptop, her eyes cold. "Mom is teaching me how to build the network. Dad, you just live in it." That was the moment I knew she saw him for what he was, an empty suit. But the insult of being overlooked was tolerable. The betrayal of trust was not. The first crack in the facade appeared 6 months ago. I was doing a routine audit of the system from my encrypted laptop at home. I noticed a discrepancy in the server load. There was a massive amount of data being funneled into a subdirectory that shouldn't have existed. I followed the digital trail. It led me away from the technical architecture and into the financial records, because I had root access to the entire network. I could see everything. Grant thought he was clever. He thought that by using shell companies and complex routing numbers, he could hide the money. But to a data architect, money is just another form of data, and data always leaves a footprint. I found transfers. Huge ones. $3 million here, $5 million there. They were labeled as R&D consultants, or offshore server maintenance. But the destination accounts were located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. I dug deeper. The consultants didn't exist. The servers were phantom machines. Grant was siphoning money out of Etheria Dynamics at a rate that would bleed the company dry within 2 years. But it wasn't just greed. It was corruption. I found emails. Grant was buying political favors. There were transfers to a super PAC controlled by Senator Miller, the very man sitting next to him tonight disguised as charitable donations. He was paying for legislation that would deregulate the biotech industry, removing the safety checks that I had insisted upon to keep our technology ethical. And then, I found Vanessa. Vanessa was not just a 28-year-old with ambition and a lack of morals. That would have been a cliché I could handle. No, Vanessa was dangerous because she was smart enough to manipulate Grant's insecurity, but not smart enough to understand the technology she was trying to steal. I accessed Grant's private communications. I read the texts. I listened to the voicemails. Vanessa had convinced Grant that Etheria had peaked. She told him that the next big thing was coming from a competitor and that his legacy was at risk. "We need to sell, Grant," she had whispered in a voice memo I listened to while folding laundry. "The market is hot. We can sell the core IP to Orion Tech for $1 billion cash. We take the money. We leave the husk of the company for the shareholders to fight over. And we disappear to Monaco. You deserve to retire. You deserve to be free of obligations." Obligations. That was me. That was Maya. Grant, in his arrogance, agreed, but there was a problem. The company bylaws. Bylaws I had written required a unanimous vote of the original founders to sell the core source code. And technically, on paper, Grant was the sole founder, but the banks required spousal consent for the liquidation of major assets due to the community property laws of Massachusetts. Vanessa had a solution for that too. "Divorce her," Vanessa had typed in a secure chat message, "but do it aggressively, paint her as unstable, cut her off from the accounts. Make her sign a settlement under duress before we announce the sale. If she is out of the picture, you are the sole decision-maker. We can sell the code, cash out, and she will be left with half of a bankrupt shell company after we strip the assets." They called it Operation Phoenix. The plan was to transfer the valuable intellectual property, my code, into a new holding company. Leaving Etheria Dynamics with nothing but debt and lawsuits, they were going to gut the company I built, sell the parts for scrap, and leave me and our daughter to face the wreckage. I sat in my office that night, the glow of the screen illuminating the tears I refused to shed. I didn't feel heartbreak. Heartbreak is for people who still have hope. I felt a cold, hard clarity. Grant thought he was the master of the universe because he could give a speech. He thought I was a relic, a piece of old hardware to be discarded. He did not realize that he was trying to steal fire from the dragon that breathed it. He wanted to sell the code fine, but he didn't know that the code obeyed only one master. He didn't know that for the last 20 years. Every line of syntax, every algorithm, every digital heartbeat of that company answered to my fingerprint alone. He was a tenant in a house I had built, and he was about to try to evict the landlord. I looked at Maya, who was sleeping in her room down the hall. They wanted to steal her inheritance. They wanted to steal her future to fund their yacht in the Mediterranean. That was the moment the wife died, and the nemesis was born. I wiped my face. I opened the terminal on my computer. I typed in the command line that I hadn't used since the day I compiled the first version of the software. "Sudo access granted." I began to type. If Grant wanted a show, I would give him a show. If he wanted to play games with money, I would show him what happens when you play against the house. He thought he was playing chess, but he was merely a pawn on a board that I had designed. And now, sitting in the gilded cage, watching him panic as the screen behind me flared to life, I felt a supreme sense of calm. The backstory was irrelevant to the audience, but it was the fuel for the fire that was about to consume him. He had spent 20 years underestimating me. It would take him about 20 seconds to realize that was the most expensive mistake of his life. The betrayal did not announce itself with the scent of cheap perfume on a collar or a lipstick stain on a shirt cuff. Those are the cliches of amateur adulterers. And Grant, for all his intellectual hollows, was careful with the physical evidence. He knew I did not do the laundry, and he knew I did not check his pockets. But Grant forgot that in the 21st century, a man's footprints are not made in sand, but in metadata, and while he could hide his body, he could not hide the digital exhaust of his greed. My investigation began on a Tuesday morning, 3 months before the graduation party, when a routine packet-sniffing algorithm I had running in the background of our home network flagged an anomaly. It was a small data spike, originating from Grant's personal laptop, tunneling through a VPN that I had not configured. I sat down at my workstation, coffee in hand, and isolated the packet. It was not a love letter. It was a transaction confirmation. But it was not a credit card purchase. It was a transfer of cryptocurrency specifically, a privacy coin designed to be untraceable to the IRS, perhaps, but not to the woman who wrote the encryption protocols for the very network he was using to access the exchange. I traced the wallet address. It led to a shell company registered in the Seychelles, which then routed to a holding firm in Zurich. It took me 4 hours to peel back the layers of obfuscation, breaking through firewalls that Grant had paid some second-rate hacker thousands of dollars to install. When I finally reached the ledger, I did not find a few $1,000s for a secret getaway. I found a contract. It was a draft agreement between a shell entity controlled by Grant and Vanessa, and a conglomerate based in Eastern Europe. The prompt explicitly stated they were not Chinese, and indeed, they were not. This was the Kruger-Vance Consortium, a shadow group known for stripping assets from distressed tech companies. The terms were horrifying in their simplicity. Grant was arranging to sell the exclusive rights to the core source code of Ethereum Dynamics, my life's work, to Kruger-Vance for $450 million. But the devil was in the details. The sale was structured as a licensing agreement that granted Kruger-Vance total ownership of the intellectual property, while the legal entity of Ethereum Dynamics would retain all the liabilities. Grant was not just selling the company, he was hollowing it out. He was selling the engine and leaving me in the driver's seat of a car that was speeding toward a cliff. I continued to dig, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The clicking sound, the only noise in the silent house. I accessed the company's internal legal drive. There, buried in a folder mislabeled Archive 2010. I found the loan documents. My breath hitched in my throat. There were 6 promissory notes, totaling $200 million, borrowed from high-risk venture debt funds. The collateral for these loans was not company stock. It was my personal assets, my trust, the house, my savings, and my future earnings. At the bottom of each document was my signature. It was a perfect replication. The loops of the B, the sharp cross of the T. Grant had used an autopen machine, likely one from the office. To forge my consent, he had legally bound me to $200 million of debt that he intended to default on the moment he fled with his $450 million. If the company went under, which it would. Once the code was gone, the creditors would not come for him in Zurich. They would come for me in Boston. He had framed me as the bag holder for his grand larceny. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a physical drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was not just a divorce. This was an assassination attempt. He was trying to kill my life, but I needed more. I needed intent. I needed to know the why and the how of the exit strategy. The documents proved the crime, but they did not reveal the narrative he planned to spin. I looked at the calendar. Grant's birthday had been 2 weeks prior. I had given him the latest model of the Titan X smartwatch. He loved it. He wore it everywhere, showing off the titanium casing and the biometric sensors to his golf buddies. "It tracks everything, Brenda," he had bragged. "Heart rate, stress levels, sleep quality. It is high security, military-grade encryption." I had smiled then. "I know. Darling, I wanted you to be safe." What I had not told him was that before I wrapped the box, I had flashed the firmware. I had replaced the operating system with a custom kernel of my own design. The military-grade encryption was real, but I held the master key. The microphone on that watch was not just for voice commands, it was a live bug, streaming audio directly to a secure server in my basement whenever the decibel level rose above a whisper. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and opened the audio logs from the previous week. I filtered for Vanessa's voice frequency. The timestamp was Friday, 7:30 in the evening. The location data placed them at a boutique hotel in downtown Boston. "You are sure she suspects nothing?" Vanessa's voice was sharp, tinny through the tiny microphone, but clear. "Brenda," Grant's voice was dismissive, accompanied by the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "She is in her own world. She is coding or gardening or whatever she does. She thinks I am stressed about the IPO." We need to move the timeline up, Vanessa said. The Kruger-Vance deal closes on the 25th. We need to be on the plane to the Maldives by the 26th. Relax, baby, Grant said. It is all handled. The debt is all in her name. When the creditors come calling, she will look like the one who mismanaged the funds. I will be the victim, the brilliant CEO whose wife gambled away the company fortune behind his back. What about the kid? Vanessa asked. Maya. My hand hovered over the pause button, trembling slightly. Maya is the leverage, Grant said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that made my skin crawl. I have already spoken to Dr. Arrington. He is on the payroll. We are building a file on Brenda, mood swings, paranoia, erratic behavior. Once the financial news breaks, we paint her as having a breakdown. I file for emergency custody. I get control of Maya's trust fund, which is substantial. By the way, thanks to her grandmother. We take the custody, we take the trust, and we leave Brenda in a state facility to rot. You would do that? Vanessa laughed, a cruel, impressed sound. Put her in an asylum. She is the one who wanted to stay in the shadows, Grant said coldly. I am just making sure she stays there permanently. Besides, Maya will get over it. We can buy her a pony or a Porsche or whatever teenagers want these days. I took the headphones off. Silence. The house was completely silent. I looked out the window at the manicured lawn, the swing set where Maya used to play. I waited for the tears. I waited for the sobbing, the wailing, the breaking of plates. That is what women in movies do when they find out their husband is a monster. But the tears did not come. Instead, a sensation of absolute zero took over my nervous system. It was as if the blood in my veins had been replaced by liquid nitrogen. The love I had held for Grant, the memories of our college days, the struggles, the shared laughter vaporized instantly. It did not fade. It was incinerated. In its place, a new directive installed itself in my brain. It was primal. It was binary. Protect the offspring. Eliminate the threat. Grant Sterling was no longer my husband. He was a virus, and I was the antivirus. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were perfectly steady. I drank it in one long gulp. Then I went back to my office and opened a new project file. I did not name it Divorce. I named it Project Nemesis. Nemesis, the Greek goddess of divine retribution, the one who punishes hubris. I needed a weapon. Not a gun. Guns are messy and illegal. I needed a legal weapon. I needed a shark who could swim in the blood-infested waters Grant was about to create. I knew exactly who to call. Arthur Pendleton was 80 years old. He was a relic of old Boston, a man who wore three-piece suits and smoked cigars in his office despite the fire codes. He was also the only lawyer in the city who had openly despised Grant's father, a corrupt real estate developer who had swindled Arthur out of a partnership 30 years ago. Arthur had a memory like an elephant and a grudge that had aged like fine wine. I made the appointment under a false name. When I walked into his office the next day, the air smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. Arthur sat behind a desk the size of a small boat, peering at me over spectacles that looked as if they were made of tortoise shell. Mrs. Sterling, he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel crunching under tires. To what do I owe the pleasure is your husband finally suing God for copyright infringement. He is trying to frame me for a $200 million fraud, sell my company for scrap, and have me committed to a mental institution so he can steal our daughter's inheritance, I said, placing a USB drive on his mahogany desk. Arthur stared at me. He did not blink. A slow, predatory smile spread across his wrinkled face, revealing teeth that looked ready to tear meat from bone. And I assume, Arthur said, picking up the drive, that this little device contains the proof. It contains everything, I replied. Audio recordings, IP logs, the forged documents, the offshore accounts. I have captured every keystroke he has made for the last 6 months. Arthur chuckled. It was a dry, dusty sound. And what do you want me to do, my dear? Get you a settlement. No, I said, leaning forward. I do not want a settlement. I do not want half. I want him destroyed. I want him to lose his money, his reputation, his freedom, and his name. I want him to wake up in a cell wondering how a woman he thought was a fool managed to checkmate him in 3 moves. Arthur plugged the drive into his computer. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "I have been waiting 30 years to bury a Sterling. I believe you and I are going to get along famously." I left his office an hour later. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. Grant thought he was the author of this story. He thought he was writing a tragedy about a crazy ex-wife. He did not realize that I had just taken the pen, and I was rewriting the genre. This was no longer a domestic drama, it was an autopsy, and the patient was still walking around, unaware that his heart had already stopped beating. The instinct of a wounded animal is to bite back immediately, to scream and claw at the aggressor the moment the pain registers. But I was not an animal. I was a mathematician, and in mathematics, you do not rush to solve the equation before you have defined all the variables. If I had gone to the police or the board of directors the morning after I discovered Grant's betrayal, I would have lost. Grant had the charm, the connections, and the high-priced crisis management teams that could spin any accusation into a narrative of a jealous, hysterical wife trying to sabotage a visionary leader. He would have buried the evidence, paid off the witnesses, and I would have been left with nothing but a restraining order and a ruined reputation. No, to truly destroy a man like Grant Sterling, I could not just push him off the ledge. I had to convince him that the ledge was actually a bridge to his dreams, and then let him sprint off it at full speed. I needed him to commit the crime so thoroughly, so publicly, and so irrevocably that no amount of money could save him. I needed to build a Trojan horse. The first step was the technology. The asset Grant was trying to sell to the Kruger-Vance consortium was the core source code of the Genesis sequence. It was the holy grail of biotech. The buyers would undoubtedly perform technical due diligence. They would send their own engineers to test the code, to verify its efficacy, to make sure they were buying a Ferrari and not a fiercely painted go-kart. So, I went into the basement. For 3 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was the distracted, anxious housewife, pacing the living room and asking Grant if he thought blue or cream was better for the graduation napkins. By night, while Grant slept the sleep of the self-righteous, I was rewriting the genetic makeup of Etheria dynamics. I created a fork of the codebase. I called it the mirror. To any engineer looking at the surface, the mirror was identical to the original Genesis sequence. The interface was the same. The command structures were the same. It processed sample data with the same breathtaking speed. It would pass every standard stress test the Kruger-Vance team could throw at it during their preliminary review. But deep in the kernel, buried under millions of lines of syntax where no due diligence officer would ever have the time to look, I planted a logic bomb. It was a beautiful, vicious piece of coding. I programmed the software to function perfectly as long as it remained on the Etheria servers in Boston. But the moment the code was migrated to a server with an IP address outside of our specific range, say, to a server farm in Eastern Europe, the bomb would arm itself. It would not just stop working. That would be too simple. Upon activation, the software was programmed to corrupt its own database, rewriting valuable genetic data into useless gibberish. Worse, it would trigger a recursive loop that would overheat the host servers, physically destroying the hardware of anyone foolish enough to steal it. Grant was about to sell a $450 million weapon that would blow up in the buyer's face the moment they took it home. Once the technical trap was set, I turned my attention to the financial snare. This was where the psychology of greed came into play. Grant and Vanessa were motivated by one thing: liquid cash. They wanted to strip the company and run. They believed I was oblivious to the money. I needed to use that belief against them. I created a corporation. I named it Phoenix Holdings. I registered it in Delaware, using a layer of privacy proxies that made it difficult, but not impossible, to trace back to me. Then, I began to move money. I did not move real money. I moved potential money. I transferred the valuation of several dormant, worthless patents into Phoenix Holdings. I created falsified, projected revenue streams that looked incredibly convincing on a balance sheet. I made Phoenix Holdings look like a secret vault where I, Brenda, the unsuspecting wife, was stashing away family assets to protect them from the volatile market. I made the account look as though it held $50 million in liquid assets. Then, I left the breadcrumbs. I left a bank statement for Phoenix Holdings on the printer in the home office, just peeking out from under a stack of recipes. I knew Grant's habits. I knew he snooped. It took less than 24 hours. I was in the garden, pruning roses, when I saw Grant through the window of the study. He was holding the paper. His eyes were wide. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of the document. Then he made a call. I could not hear the words, but I saw the body language. It was the excited, jittery movement of a hyena that has just found a fresh carcass. He had called Vanessa. They thought they had caught me hiding money. They thought they had found the jackpot. That evening, the dynamic in the house shifted. Grant was suddenly more attentive. He poured me a glass of wine. He asked about my day. He was trying to figure out how to get his hands on Phoenix Holdings without alerting me that he knew it existed. "You know, Brenda," he said, swirling his drink, "I have been thinking, with the market being so unstable, we really should consolidate our assets, make sure everything is in order for Maya's college fund." "I suppose so, Grant," I said, making my voice sound small and weary. "But honestly, all this paperwork gives me a migraine. I do not understand half of what the accountants send us, the tax forms, the liability waivers. It is all just Greek to me." Grant's eyes lit up. This was the opening he needed. "Well, you do not have to worry about that. That is what I am here for. I can handle the administrative burden. In fact, why don't we update our power of attorney documents just for specific business dealings? That way, if anything comes up, I can sign for you, and you do not have to be bothered with the boring details." It was the classic move of a manipulator. He wanted legal authority to sign my name so he could transfer the assets of Phoenix Holdings to himself before filing for divorce. "Oh, Grant, would you—" I looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "That would be such a relief. I just want to focus on the garden and Maya's graduation party." The next day, he brought the papers home. They were standard general power of attorney forms, or so he thought. What Grant did not know was that I had anticipated this. I had prepared my own set of documents. They looked identical to the standard forms. The font was the same, the headers were the same, but the clauses in the fine print were radically different. I used a sleight of hand that any close-up magician would have admired. When Grant laid the papers out on the kitchen island for me to sign, I accidentally spilled my coffee on the first page. "Oh, clumsy me," I cried, dabbing at the stain. "I am so sorry. Grant." "It is fine. It is fine," he said, trying to hide his irritation. "I have another copy in my briefcase." While he turned his back to get the fresh set, I swapped the signature pages of the document remaining on the table. The pages I substituted were not for a general power of attorney. They were for an assumption of personal liability. By the time he turned back, the switch was done. I signed the document with a shaky hand, acting the part of the frazzled wife. "There, all done. You handle it, Grant. I will take care of everything," he said, snatching the papers away. For the next 6 months, Grant went on a signing spree. He used the authority he thought he had to transfer the assets of Phoenix Holdings into his own private accounts. He thought he was stealing $50 million from me, but because of the document switch and the specific way I had structured Phoenix Holdings, every time he signed a transfer request, he was actually signing a confession. Phoenix Holdings was not a pot of gold. It was a containment unit for toxic debt. The assets I had created were leveraged against high-interest loans that I had taken out in the company's name loans that were guaranteed not by the company, but by the authorized signatory by transferring Phoenix Holdings to himself. Grant was personally assuming responsibility for $50 million of debt. He was also signing tax declarations that stated He was the sole beneficiary of these funds, which meant when the IRS realized the funds were non-existent but the tax liability was real, he would be on the hook for tax evasion on money he never actually had. Furthermore, I had attached certain riders to the Phoenix transfer documents. One of them was a clause that retroactively accepted personal liability for any unauthorized intellectual property transfers made by Etheria Dynamics. Essentially, I had handed him a pen, and he had used it to write, "I am guilty" on every available surface. Vanessa, to her credit, was suspicious. I monitored their texts. "It is too easy, Grant," she texted him one afternoon. "Why does she have $50 million in a shell company? Where did it come from? We need to be careful." But Grant was blinded by the numbers. "Who cares where it came from?" he replied. "It is there. I saw the balance sheet. She probably inherited it from that aunt in Connecticut and tried to hide it. We are taking it. It is marital property. Once we move it to the offshore account, it is gone. She is too stupid to track it. Just make sure the transfer is done before the graduation party," Vanessa urged. "I want to announce our engagement knowing we are set for life." "Done," Grant wrote back. "I am signing the final transfer order tomorrow." I read that text while sitting in my office, listening to the hum of the servers. I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was like watching a man construct a guillotine, sharpen the blade, test the release mechanism, and then voluntarily lay his neck on the block. Convinced he was building a doorway, the complexity of the trap was its beauty. If I had simply stolen money from him, he could have sued me. If I had simply locked him out of the accounts, he would have fought me in court for years. But by letting him steal a poisoned apple, I ensured that his destruction would be entirely self-inflicted. Every document was notarized. Every digital transfer was logged with his biometric authentication. He was stealing debt. He was stealing liability. He was stealing a prison sentence. And the best part? He was rushing to do it. He was sprinting toward the finish line, terrified that I would wake up and stop him. He didn't know that I was the one firing the starter pistol and cheering him on. The week before the party, Grant came home with a bottle of champagne. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Celebration?" I asked, looking up from my book. "Just a good day at the office," he grinned. "Closed a big loop, tied up some loose ends." He had just finalized the transfer of Phoenix Holdings. He believed he was now $50 million richer. He poured me a glass, and we clinked crystal flutes. "To the future," he said, his eyes mocking me. "To the future," I replied, sipping the wine. I knew that the moment he finalized that transfer, the automated audit algorithms at the IRS, which I may have anonymously tipped off, would be triggered. I knew that the logic bomb in the source code was armed and ready for the handover to Kruger Vance, which was scheduled for the morning after the graduation. He had walked the horse into the city. He had closed the gates. He was celebrating his victory. He had no idea that the soldiers inside were already unlatching the hatch, and they were not carrying olive branches. They were carrying indictments. The final week before the graduation was a study in atmospheric pressure. The air in our sprawling colonial house in Beacon Hill felt heavy, charged with the static electricity of unsaid words and impending violence. To the outside observer, we were the picture of a successful family preparing for a milestone. The florists were coming and going with arrangements of white lilies. The caterers were finalizing the menu for the pre-party brunch. But inside the walls, a silent war was reaching its fever pitch. Grant was in high spirits. It was a manic, terrifying kind of happiness. He whistled while he shaved. He hummed while he tied his tie. It was the behavior of a man who believed he had successfully dug a tunnel out of prison and was just waiting for the moonless night to make his escape. He looked at me with a pity that he barely bothered to conceal. In his mind, I was already a ghost haunting his future bachelor pad. On Tuesday evening, 5 days before the ceremony, Grant walked into the library where I was reading. He was carrying a thick, leather-bound folder. The leather was expensive, the smell of it pungent and earthy. He placed it on the desk with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel striking a block. "Brenda," he said, his voice dripping with that faux concern he had perfected over the last few months. We need to handle some housekeeping, with the company restructuring and the market being what it is. The lawyers advised me to secure Maya's future assets now, just to be safe. I looked at the folder. I did not need to open it to know what was inside. I had already read the digital drafts he had foolishly stored on a shared cloud drive he thought I had forgotten about. He called it restructuring. A more accurate term would have been financial assassination. The documents in that folder were designed to transfer the deed of our house, the house my grandmother had left me, into a liability holding company. They assigned the entirety of the mortgage debt, along with 3 other high-interest business loans he had secretly taken out, directly to me. If I signed these papers as they were, I would not just be divorced, I would be destitute. I would be legally responsible for $6 million of debt with no assets to pay for it. He was effectively handing me a concrete block and asking me to go for a swim. "Of course, Grant," I said, putting down my book. "Anything for Maya. You know I just want her to be secure." I stood up and walked over to the desk. I was wearing a loose cardigan, the sleeves slightly too long, a deliberate choice. "It is a lot of legalese," Grant said, flipping open the folder. "Standard stuff, indemnity clauses, asset allocation. I have flagged the signature pages for you." He handed me a Mont Blanc pen. The weight of it felt cold in my hand. "I trust you, Grant," I said softly. "I know you are the businessman. I am just the gardener." I reached for the folder, and then, with a clumsiness that I had rehearsed for 2 hours in front of the bathroom mirror, I let it slip. The heavy binder hit the edge of the desk and fell open, spewing papers across the Persian rug. "Oh, goodness," I cried, dropping to my knees. "I am so clumsy lately. My hands just do not seem to work right." "Jesus, Brenda," Grant sighed, an exquisite note of irritation in his voice. He bent down to help me gather them. "Be careful. These are legal documents, not grocery lists." I am sorry. I apologized, my hands fluttering over the papers. This was the moment, the Kansas City shuffle. While Grant was reaching for a stack of papers near the chair leg, my left hand, the hand hidden by the long sleeve of my cardigan, slid into the pile. I was not just gathering papers, I was swapping them. Tucked inside my sleeve, held in place by a thin elastic band, was a set of 5 pages I had printed earlier that morning on identical watermarked paper. In the chaos of the scattered documents, with Grant's eyes focused on the mess rather than my hands, I performed the switch. I pulled the debt assignment pages into my sleeve and deposited the share transfer pages onto the pile. It took less than 4 seconds. "Here," I said, handing him a disorganized stack. "I think I got them all. Let me just put them in order." I made a show of shuffling them, tapping the edges on the floor to straighten them. I placed the folder back on the desk. "Okay," I breathed, pressing a hand to my chest. "Show me where to sign." Grant flipped to the back of the document. He did not read the text. Why would he? He had printed it himself. He pointed to the line marked spouse. I signed my name with a flourish. Grant watched me, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He thought he had just made me homeless. He did not know that the page I had just signed was actually a binding directive transferring 100% of his personal voting shares in Etheria Dynamics into an irrevocable trust for Maya, with me named as the sole trustee until she turned 25. He packed the folder away, patted my shoulder patronizingly, and left the room. "Good girl," his eyes seemed to say. "Now go back to your knitting while the adults talk." I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I pulled the original debt documents out of my sleeve and fed them, one by one, into the shredder. The sound of the paper tearing was the most satisfying music I had heard in years. 2 days later, on Thursday afternoon, the second crisis hit. Maya came home early from her final rehearsal. She walked in through the garage, silent as a cat. Grant was in the sunroom, on the phone. He had left the door open to catch the spring breeze. I was in the kitchen, preparing tea. When I saw Maya freeze in the hallway, her face went white, then read. Grant's voice floated out, loud and arrogant. Yeah, Vanessa. Do not worry about the house. We will have the eviction notice served on Monday morning. I want that old hag out by noon. We can probably sell the place for $4 million. It will cover the cost of the new penthouse. He laughed. Maya. She will be fine. She is 18. She can get a job, or she can live with her mother in whatever trailer park Brenda ends up in. I am done supporting dead weight. I saw Maya's hands curl into fists. Her backpack slid off her shoulder. She took a step toward the sunroom, her mouth opening to scream. She was going to confront him. She was going to blow the whole operation. I moved. I dropped the tea towel and sprinted across the kitchen in my socks, catching Maya just as she reached the threshold. I clamped my hand over her mouth and dragged her backward into the pantry, pulling the door shut behind us. She struggled, tears streaming down her face, muffled sounds of rage vibrating against my palm. Shh, I whispered, my voice fierce and low. Do not say a word. I slowly removed my hand. Maya was shaking. He called you a hag. Mom. He said he is going to evict us. I am going to kill him. No, I said, gripping her shoulders. You are not going to do anything. You are going to listen to me. Why? She hissed. Why are you letting him do this? Why are we just taking it? I looked into my daughter's eyes that had the same sharp intelligence as mine. It was time she knew that her mother was not a victim. We are not taking anything, Maya, I said, my voice turning to steel. We are waiting. If you go in there now and scream, he wins. He will hide the money. He will cover his tracks. He will lawyer up. I leaned closer. I need you to trust me. I have a plan, but for it to work, I need you to be the best actress in the world. I need you to smile at him at dinner. I need you to let him think he is the king. And on Saturday, at the party, I need you to be surprised. Maya stared at me. She saw the calculation in my face. She saw the lack of fear. Slowly, her breathing steadied. What are you going to do? She whispered. I am going to burn his kingdom down. I replied. And I am going to let him light the match. She nodded. She wiped her tears. Okay, I can do it. That night, while Grant and Maya ate dinner in a tense, artificial silence, I went upstairs to my secure terminal. It was time for the final financial migration. Grant was so focused on the fake Phoenix Holdings account that he had stopped monitoring the legitimate family accounts. He assumed they were frozen or insignificant. He was wrong. I logged into our joint savings, the investment portfolios, and the emergency liquid funds. Total value, $2,400,000. It was not a fortune compared to the company, but it was real money. It was our safety net. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a wire transfer. The destination was a numbered account in Zurich, Switzerland. The account holder was not me. It was Maya Sterling. I watched the progress bar load. 10%, 50%, 100%, transfer complete. The accounts in Boston were now empty. If Grant tried to buy a pack of gum with the joint debit card on Sunday morning, it would be declined. Friday night arrived, the eve of the execution. The house was dark. Outside, the Boston wind howled through the trees. Beside me in the master bed, Grant was asleep. He was snoring softly, his face relaxed. He was dreaming of his new life with Vanessa, of the millions he thought he had stolen, of the freedom he believed was hours away. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I was not afraid. I was not sad. I felt the hyper-awareness of a soldier in the trench checking her rifle one last time before the whistle blows. I slipped out of bed and went to my study. I did not turn on the lights. The glow of the monitor was enough. I had one final task: the government. I opened a secure browser, routing my connection through 3 different countries to ensure anonymity. I navigated to the whistleblower portal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I attached a zip file. It contained the proof of the insider trading, the fraudulent loans, and the attempt to sell the core source code without board approval. I typed a brief message in the description box. Grant Sterling, CEO of Etheria Dynamics, is planning to flee the country within 48 hours after liquidating company assets. He is currently in possession of a stolen passport under the name of David Vance, a passport I had found in his safe 2 days ago and photographed. I did not click send immediately. I opened a second tab, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's tip line. I uploaded the evidence of the wire fraud and the money laundering schemes involving the fake consultants. I looked at the clock. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I set a scheduler script. I did not want the emails to land in an inbox at 3 in the morning where they might be ignored until Monday. I wanted them to hit the urgent queue when the duty officers were fresh and alert. I set the delivery time for 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, exactly 1 hour before Grant was scheduled to give his speech. This would give the authorities just enough time to verify the immediate flight risk and mobilize a team to the location I had provided, the Gilded Cage restaurant. I hovered my mouse over the schedule button. "Goodbye, Grant," I whispered into the darkness. I clicked the mouse. Action confirmed. I closed the laptop. I walked back to the bedroom and climbed under the covers next to the man who was planning to destroy me. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All that was left to do was wait for the snap. The silence that descended upon the Gilded Cage was not the hush of admiration. It was the suffocating vacuum of a room collectively realizing they were witnessing a public execution. But Grant, blinded by the stage lights of his own ego, mistook the shock for reverence. He stood there, one hand in the pocket of his Italian trousers, the other gesturing toward the woman who had just helped him dismantle our family. "Brenda and I have developed in different directions," Grant proclaimed, his voice smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of humanity. It was the same tone he used when explaining a quarterly loss to the shareholders, detached, corporate, and vaguely optimistic about the destruction. "I have spent the last decade running at a pace that few can understand. A visionary needs a partner who can match his stride, not an anchor who yearns for the safety of the harbor." He turned to Vanessa, who was beaming with the predatory delight of a woman who believes she has just secured the bag. Grant reached out and pulled her close to his side. It was a possessive, theatrical gesture. Vanessa rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to object. She raised her left hand to tuck a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear, a movement calculated solely to display the ring. It was a diamond, a massive, vulgar thing. It caught the light of the crystal chandeliers and fractured it into 1,000 shards of spectrum. I looked at it and felt a dry, mathematical amusement. That was the cushion-cut stone from the flamboyant jeweler on Newberry Street. The invoice for it, $45,000, had been buried in the miscellaneous hardware procurement file for the Q3 budget. Technically, the shareholders of Etheria Dynamics had just bought my husband's mistress her engagement ring. "I have found a true soulmate," Grant continued, squeezing Vanessa's waist. "Someone who understands the sacrifices of leadership. Vanessa has been my rock during this transition." A ripple of unease went through the guests. I saw Sarah, my roommate from college who was now a pediatric surgeon, grip the edge of the table. Her face was flushed with fury. She started to push her chair back, her mouth opening to shout something that would undoubtedly be colorful and defensive on my behalf. I caught her eye. I did not shake my head. I simply narrowed my eyes and gave a microscopic dip of my chin. "Sit down," the look said. "Do not interfere with the demolition crew when the charges are already set." Sarah hesitated, looked at the terrifying calmness in my face, and slowly sank back into her seat. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that I was not the victim in this scenario. Grant, oblivious to the silent communication between the women in the room, plowed ahead. "Now, I know this is sudden, but in business, as in life, timing is everything. For the stability of Etheria Dynamics, and to ensure that our upcoming IPO is not marred by speculation, I am taking decisive action tonight." He cleared his throat. adopting a somber, authoritative expression. Effective immediately, I will be assuming full operational control of all family assets and voting shares. Brenda will be taking a much-needed sabbatical. She has been unwell lately. The stress of the industry is too much for her. He was painting me as the fragile, hysterical woman. It was the oldest play in the book. Then came the physical insult. Grant reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a long, slate blue envelope. It was thick. It was ominous. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it. The envelope spun through the air, sliding across the white linen tablecloth, knocking over the salt shaker, and coming to a rest right in front of my untouched plate of sea bass. "This is the divorce filing," Grant said, his voice loud enough for the waiters in the back to hear. "And a restraining order barring you from the company premises and our financial accounts. I suggest you sign the acknowledgement. Take the settlement we have outlined, and try to keep a shred of dignity. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to erase me. He wanted to humiliate me so thoroughly in front of the Boston elite that I would crawl into a hole and never come out. Beside me, the chair scraped violently against the floor. Maya stood up. My daughter's face was a mask of anguish. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, ruining the professional makeup we had done that morning. Was she acting? We had rehearsed the outrage, yes, but looking at her now, shaking with the raw intensity of a teenager watching her father destroy her world, I knew the line between performance and reality had blurred. "What are you doing?" Maya screamed. Her voice cracked, high and desperate. "Dad, this is my graduation. How could you do this?" The room flinched. The raw emotion of a child cuts through social politeness like a knife. Grant looked at his daughter with a flicker of annoyance. He did not step toward her. He did not offer a hug. He looked at her as if she were a heckler at a press conference. "Maya, sit down," Grant snapped. "You are being dramatic. This is exactly why we need new leadership in this family. Your mother has made you soft." "You are ruining everything," Maya sobbed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You are throwing Mom away like she is nothing. I am doing this for your future. Maya," Grant raised his voice, his patience snapping. "You think money grows on trees. You think your trust fund manages itself. I am making the hard choices so you can live the life you are accustomed to. One day, when you grow up and stop thinking like a child, you will thank me." He turned back to the crowd, dismissing her pain with a wave of his hand. "Teenagers," he muttered to Senator Miller, rolling his eyes. "Always so emotional." That was the trigger. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The guests were no longer just embarrassed. They were horrified. Grant had crossed the line from cad to monster. I placed my hands on the edge of the table. I felt the cool, smooth wood of the table under the cloth. I pushed myself up. I did not stand quickly. I unfolded myself with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator rising from the tall grass. My movements were fluid, controlled, and absolutely silent. I did not look at the guests. I did not look at Maya. I locked my eyes on Grant. He was smiling at Vanessa, whispering something in her ear, probably a joke about my silence. He thought I was stunned. He thought I was broken. "Grant," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not shout, but the timbre of it was so distinct, so piercingly cold, that it cut through the murmurs of the room instantly. Grant turned to look at me. His smile faltered. Just a fraction. He expected to see tears. He expected to see a woman trembling, begging, or perhaps fainting. Instead, he saw a woman standing perfectly straight, holding a glass of red wine in one hand, with a pulse that was likely slower than his own. I picked up the blue envelope with my free hand. I felt the weight of it. I looked at it for a moment, as if it were a curious insect I had found on my shoe. Then, I dropped it back onto the table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud. "You speak of dignity," I said, taking a slow step around the table, moving toward the center of the room. "You speak of the future. You speak of truth." I stopped 3 feet away from them. Vanessa took a half step back. She was not stupid. She sensed the danger radiating off me. She looked at Grant, waiting for him to protect her. But Grant was staring at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Brenda, do not make a scene," Grant warned. Though his voice lacked its earlier conviction, "Just leave. The security team is outside." I ignored him. I took a sip of my wine, never breaking eye contact. "You asked me to sign and keep my dignity," I said. A small, terrifying smile curling the corners of my lips. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My eyes were dead. They were the eyes of a judge who has already signed the death warrant. But you see, Grant, dignity is not something you can give me, and it is certainly not something you can take away. I turned to the crowd. I saw the faces of the bankers, the lawyers, the socialites. They were mesmerized. They knew, on a primal level, that the power dynamic in the room had just shifted violently. "My husband," I said to the room, "believes that he is the architect of Etheria Dynamics. He believes that he is the genius who built the empire that feeds all of you." I turned back to Grant. "But you and I know the truth, don't we? Grant, we know who passed the calculus exams at MIT. We know who wrote the patent applications. And we know who actually built the Genesis sequence while you were busy networking on the golf course." Grant's face turned a mottled shade of red. "That is enough," he hissed. "You are drunk. Get her out of here." He signaled to the waiter, but the waiter did not move. I had tipped the staff very well before the dinner began. $5,000 tends to buy a lot of selective hearing. "I am not drunk, Grant," I said softly. "I am just clarified." I took another step closer. I could smell his cologne. It smelled like fear and expensive musk. "You wanted to give a speech about the future," I said. "You wanted to announce your new life with Vanessa. You wanted to celebrate your freedom." I paused. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. "I think that is wonderful," I continued, my voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. "I believe in celebrating milestones, and since you have been so generous as to give me this legal notification," I gestured to the blue envelope, "I feel it is only fair that I return the favor." Grant looked at me, his eyes darting side to side. "What are you talking about?" "I have a gift for you, Grant," I said. "A graduation gift. Not for Maya, for you. Because today, you are graduating too." "Graduating from what?" he sneered, trying to regain his composure. "From your nagging—" "No," I whispered, leaning in so close that only he and Vanessa could hear the final word. "From your illusion." I straightened up and looked at the projection screen that dominated the far wall of the dining room. It was currently displaying a paused image of Maya as a toddler, smiling innocently in a sandbox. It was the last remnant of the wholesome family image Grant had tried to project. "Thank you, Grant," I said, raising my voice to address the entire hall one last time. "Thank you for showing everyone exactly who you are. It makes what I am about to do so much easier to explain to the jury." Grant froze. "Jury," I smiled. "Oh, yes, you did not think I came to this party unarmed, did you?" I raised my wine glass in a mock toast. "To the architect," I said, and then, with a sharp, decisive movement, I pulled the iPad from my clutch and tapped the screen. The image of the smiling toddler vanished. The room went dark for a split second, and the hum of the projector fan grew louder, like the sound of a guillotine blade being hoisted to the top of the frame. The show was over. The trial was about to begin. The image of my daughter playing in the sandbox flickered and vanished, replaced instantly by the stark, high-contrast interface of an international banking portal. The screen was 10 feet tall, making the numbers projected upon it large enough to be read from the parking lot. "This gift," I said, my voice cutting through the confused murmurs of the room, "is called the truth." The room fell into a silence so absolute it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the ventilation system. Every eye was fixed on the screen. It was not a slideshow of memories. It was a live feed of the Phoenix Holdings corporate account, the very entity Grant believed was filled with $50 million of my hidden fortune. But the number displayed in the center of the screen was not green. It was a violent, crimson red, and it was preceded by a minus sign. Negative $50 million. Below the catastrophic balance, a bright yellow banner flashed with a warning that pulsed like a heartbeat. Account frozen. Federal investigation pending. RICO statute violation. Suspected money laundering. Grant blinked. He squinted at the screen, his brain refusing to process the data. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he did not speak. "What is this?" he stammered, his confident baritone reduced to a confused croak. "Is this a joke? Is this some kind of Photoshop trick?" "It is a live feed, Grant," I replied, tapping the screen of my iPad to scroll down, revealing the transaction history on the big screen. The scroll list showed hundreds of withdrawals, penalties, and interest accumulation on high-risk loans. "You can check it on your phone if you like. Oh, wait, you might want to check your notifications first." As if on cue, the sound of digital panic erupted at the head table. Grant's phone, lying on the table next to his champagne glass, lit up and buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. It began to vibrate across the tablecloth like a trapped insect. Next to him, Vanessa's clutch bag began to vibrate. She reached into it with trembling fingers and pulled out her phone. Her face, which had been flushed with triumph only moments ago, drained of color until she looked like a wax figure melting under heat. "Grant," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Grant, I just got an alert from American Express. My black card. It says it has been terminated." "What?" Grant snapped. Snatching his own phone, he unlocked it, his thumbs fumbling over the screen. "My personal checking," Vanessa hissed, staring at her screen in horror. "Zero. How can it be zero? I had $80,000 in there this morning." "It is not just zero, Vanessa," I helpfully interjected. "Look closer at the transaction code. It says seizure order. That happens when your assets are tied to a federal investigation involving organized crime and fraud." Grant looked up from his phone, his eyes wild. "My accounts are locked," he said, the reality starting to seep in. "Everything, the joint account, the investment portfolio, even the Cayman routing number, it is all locked." He turned on me, his face twisting into a mask of rage. "You did this. You hacked us. You are trying to steal my money." "I did not steal a penny, Grant," I said, taking a casual sip of my wine. "I merely facilitated the transfer of ownership that you so desperately wanted." I gestured to the guests, who were now watching the drama unfold with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. "You just stood here, in front of 100 of the most influential people in Boston, and declared that you were taking full control of all family assets. You declared that you were the sole decision-maker. You declared that you were the architect." I stepped closer to him. "Congratulations. Darling, you succeeded. You are now the sole owner of Phoenix Holdings." "Phoenix is yours," Grant roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "That is your shell company. That is where you hid the money." "No, Grant," I replied, my voice calm and deadly. "Phoenix was my company, past tense, until last week." I swiped the iPad screen again. The banking interface disappeared, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a document. It was the power of attorney transfer form he had signed in the kitchen, believing he was stealing my fortune. "Recognize this?" I asked. "That is your signature, and right there, in paragraph 4, clause B. Let me read it for the room." I looked at the text on the screen. "The undersigned, Grant Sterling, hereby accepts full and retroactive personal liability for all debts, liens, and legal encumbrances associated with Phoenix Holdings, and acknowledges that he is the sole beneficiary and operator of said entity." I looked back at him. "You signed it on Tuesday. You were so eager to steal what you thought was $50 million that you did not bother to read the fine print. Phoenix Holdings never had assets. Grant, it was a debt containment vessel. I aggregated $50 million of toxic loans and high-risk liabilities into that company. And you stole it. You stole the debt. You stole the tax fraud liability. And because you used your authority to transfer it to your name, you are now personally responsible for every single cent. The room gasped. I saw Senator Miller slowly pull his napkin off his lap and place it on the table, distancing himself from Grant as if failure were a contagious disease. "That is a lie," Grant screamed. "It is a trap. She set me up." "Of course I set you up," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. "But you were the one who walked into it. You were the one who was so blinded by greed that you signed your life away just to spite me." Vanessa grabbed Grant's arm, her fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "Grant, fix this. Tell them it is not true. My money is gone." "Shut up." Grant shoved her away. He looked at the crowd, sweating profusely. "She is crazy. She is a vindictive, unstable woman. None of this is legal. I will have this annulled." "It is perfectly legal," I said. "And the Securities and Exchange Commission seems to think so too. That brings me to the second part of my gift." I swiped the screen again. Grant flinched, as if expecting a physical blow. This time, a video player appeared. It was a grainy, black-and-white recording, but the audio was crystal clear. It was the bedroom of the boutique hotel. Grant was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a glass of scotch. Vanessa was pacing in front of him. Grant's voice from the speakers. "We strip the assets by Friday. I have already lined up the buyer for the source code, the Kruger-Vance Consortium. They are wiring $450 million to the Zurich account." Vanessa's voice. "What about the shareholders? What about the board?" Grant's voice. "Screw the shareholders. They are buying a ghost. Once we transfer the code, Etheria is worthless. Let Brenda deal with the bankruptcy. By the time they realize the company is hollow, we will be in the Maldives." The video continued. Grant's voice. "I am going to file for full custody of Maya, not because I want her, but because the trust fund is attached to her guardianship. Once I declare Brenda incompetent, I get control of the trust. It is another $20 million. Easy." The silence in the restaurant was broken by a single sound. A sob. Maya was standing with her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that no child should ever have to feel. She was looking at the screen, hearing her father, her hero, talk about her as if she were nothing more than a financial instrument. Grant looked at the screen. He saw himself. He heard his own voice conspiring to commit securities fraud, embezzlement, and custodial interference. He looked at the crowd. The faces that had looked at him with admiration an hour ago were now looking at him with disgust. The investors were on their phones, likely calling their lawyers to sue him. The socialites were whispering, their eyes darting between him and the screen. That is fake," Grant stammered, but his voice was thin, reedy. "Deepfake technology. AI. It is not real." "It is real enough for them," I said, pointing toward the heavy double doors at the entrance of the restaurant. As if choreographed by fate itself, the doors burst open. The light from the lobby spilled into the dim dining room, silhouetting 6 figures. They were not waiters. They were not guests. They wore windbreakers with bright yellow letters on the back. FBI. Behind them were 4 uniformed Boston police officers. The lead agent, a tall woman with a face like carved granite, scanned the room. Her eyes landed on the head table. She marched forward, her boots thudding heavily on the expensive parquet floor. "Grant Sterling," she barked. Grant looked at the agent. He looked at the screen, where his own voice was still playing on a loop, discussing how to screw the shareholders. He looked at Vanessa, who was now weeping hysterically and trying to hide behind him, and then he looked at me. I was standing perfectly still, the wineglass still in my hand. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched him. I was the scientist observing the reaction in the petri dish. Grant's face went through a metamorphosis. The shock melted away. The denial evaporated. What was left was pure, unadulterated terror. The blood rushed to his head, turning his face a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar like ropes straining to snap. He realized, in that split second, that his life was over. The suits, the cars, the reputation, the freedom, it was all gone. He was not going to the Maldives. He was going to a federal penitentiary, and he knew, with a certainty that must have burned like acid, that the woman he had called a hag and a burden was the one who had put him there. His mouth opened. At first, no sound came out. It was just a gasp, a desperate intake of air, and then it ripped out of him. It was not a word. It was not a plea. It was a scream, a high-pitched, vibrating shriek that sounded less like a man and more like a pig being slaughtered. It was the sound of an ego shattering into a million jagged pieces. No! The sound was so loud it was physically painful. He ran both hands through his hair, gripping it tightly as if he might rip it out entirely. "You," he roared, his words bursting across the table. "You ruined everything, you monster." The clarity faded from his eyes. The police no longer mattered. Neither did the crowd. Even his daughter slipped from his thoughts. His entire attention locked onto the person he believed was responsible for his collapse. He surged forward. He threw himself over the table, sending crystal glasses skidding away and toppling the centerpiece onto the floor. He scrambled across the linen in a blind frenzy, eyes unhinged, arms stretching toward me. "I'll finish this," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I'll finish this." I didn't move. I didn't react. I didn't step away. I simply watched him rush toward me because I knew something he didn't. I knew the waiter standing 3 feet to my right hadn't been hired for his wine service, but for his former life as a Navy SEAL. Grant, however, had no idea. Grant only knew that he wanted to wrap his hands around my neck and squeeze until the truth stopped staring at him. He was airborne, his fingers inches from my face. His scream echoing off the mahogany walls, a portrait of a man who had fallen from the top of the world and hit every branch on the way down. Grant was airborne for less than 2 seconds, but in my mind, the moment stretched out like a slow-motion car crash. I could see the veins bulging in his neck, the spittle flying from his lips, and the desperate, animalistic intent in his eyes. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to wrap his manicured hands around my throat and squeeze until the reality I had projected on the screen disappeared. He was a man falling from a great height, flailing for a handhold, and deciding that if he was going to hit the ground, he would drag me down with him. But Grant was not a fighter. He was a corporate executive who got winded climbing a flight of stairs. And he had forgotten that I was a woman who prepared for contingencies. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched him come, calculating the trajectory, before his fingers could even graze the silk of my dress. A shadow moved from my right. It was the waiter, who had been diligently refilling water glasses all evening. His name was Marcus, and he was a former private contractor who specialized in executive protection. I had paid him $6,000 for this specific evening, and as Grant lunged, Marcus earned every penny. Marcus did not punch him. That would have been messy. Instead, he stepped into Grant's path with the fluidity of a dancer, used Grant's own momentum against him, and executed a perfect armbar takedown. There was a sickening thud as Grant's chest hit the edge of the table, followed by the clatter of silverware and the crash of breaking china. He was slammed face first into the plate of sea bass he had been too busy pontificating to eat. The white linen tablecloth soaked up the spilled wine, turning a deep, violent crimson that looked alarmingly like blood. "Get off me!" Grant screamed, his voice muffled by the tablecloth and the fish. "Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of Etheria Dynamics. I will have you killed." Marcus ignored him, twisting Grant's arm behind his back with a practiced efficiency until Grant's forehead was pinned against the wood of the table. "Stay down, sir," Marcus said, his voice calm and bored. "Do not resist." The room erupted. The paralysis that had held the guests in check shattered. Chairs scraped loudly against the parquet floor as people scrambled to get away from the violence. A wine glass shattered somewhere in the back. Several of the society wives screamed, clutching their pearls, while their husbands, the captains of industry, the brave venture capitalists, did exactly what I expected them to do. They pulled out their smartphones. I watched with a cold detachment as 50 camera lenses turned toward the head table. They were live streaming the downfall of their friend. The social contract of the elite had dissolved instantly. Grant was no longer one of them. He was content. He was viral footage. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the kitchen entrance. Vanessa. She had seized the moment of chaos to try and slip away. She had kicked off her high heels to run faster. Clutching her designer bag to her chest like a shield, she was sprinting toward the service exit, her eyes wide with the terror of a rat sensing the ship going down. She made it 10 feet. The kitchen doors swung open, and 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out, blocking her path. They were not smiling. They did not look like the polite police officers you see on television. They looked like moving walls of bureaucracy. "Vanessa Clay?" the lead agent asked, though it was not really a question. Vanessa skidded to a halt, her bare feet sliding on the polished floor. She looked left, then right, realizing she was trapped. She looked back at Grant, who was currently being handcuffed by the Boston police officers who had swarmed the head table, and then the loyalty of the soulmate evaporated. "It was him!" Vanessa shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Grant. "He made me do it. I am just an employee. I am the director of strategy. I just followed orders. He forced me to sign those papers." She began to sob, loud, ugly gasps for air. "I did not know about the embezzlement. I thought it was a legitimate bonus structure. Please, I am a victim here." Grant, whose face was now pressed against the table, twisted his head to look at her. The betrayal on his face was almost comical. "You lying witch!" he roared, spitting a piece of garnish out of his mouth. "It was your idea. You told me to sell the code. You told me to cut Brenda out." "Secure them both," the lead FBI agent ordered. An agent stepped forward and took Vanessa's wrists when the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut. She let out a wail that sounded like a siren. It was pathetic. It was the sound of a woman realizing that her beauty and her manipulation tactics had no currency in federal court. Back at the table, the Boston police chief, a man I had known socially for years, stepped forward. He looked down at Grant with a mixture of pity and professional sternness. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Grant Sterling," the chief announced, his voice booming over the commotion. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and violation of the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Grant was hauled to his feet. He looked unrecognizable. His bespoke suit was stained with wine and sauce. His hair was standing up in wild tufts. His face was a map of rage and confusion. "This is a mistake," Grant shouted, thrashing against the grip of the officers. "You cannot arrest me. I have rights. That woman." He jerked his head toward me. "She hacked my accounts. She stole my money. Check the servers. The money is gone." "The money is exactly where it is supposed to be. Mr. Sterling," the FBI agent said, stepping into the circle. "We have been tracking the Phoenix Holdings ledger for weeks. We have your IP address, your biometric login, and your signature on every transfer. You moved the debt yourself." No, Grant screamed. "It was supposed to be assets. She told me it was assets." The crowd murmured. He had just admitted to trying to steal assets. He was digging his own grave with his tongue, and he couldn't stop. I took a step forward. The officers tensed, but I held up a hand. "It is all right," I said calmly. "I just want to say goodbye to my husband." I walked up to him. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against his stained shirt. He looked at me with hate pure, distilled hate. But behind the hate, there was fear. He was starting to realize that the nightmare was real. I leaned in close. I could smell the sweat and the fear on him. I wanted him to remember this scent. "You wanted freedom, Grant," I whispered, my voice low and intimate, meant only for his ears. "You stood on this stage and told the world you wanted to be free of me. You wanted a new life." I paused, letting the words sink in. "Well, you have it. You are going to be free of me for a very, very long time. 25 years, give or take. You will have all the time in the world to think about your strategy. And do not worry about the company, or Maya, or the house. They belong to me now." Grant's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to scream again, to curse me, but the words died in his throat. He looked into my eyes and saw the vast, empty space where his wife used to be. He realized, finally, that he hadn't been fighting a spouse. He had been fighting a mirror, and he had lost. "Get him out of here," I said to the chief. Stepping back, the officers began to drag him toward the door. Grant stumbled, his legs refusing to work. He looked back one last time, his eyes searching the crowd for a friendly face, for someone to save him, but the crowd simply stared. They were already rewriting their history with him, erasing him from their contact lists. "My money!" Grant howled as he was pushed through the double doors, his voice cracking. "Where is my money?" And then he was gone. The doors swung shut, cutting off his voice. The flashing lights of the police cruisers outside cast a rhythmic, blue strobing light through the windows. The room was silent again, save for the soft weeping of Vanessa, who was being led out to the back exit by the federal agents. I stood alone in the center of the chaos. My heart rate had not exceeded 80 beats per minute. I felt a hand on my arm. I turned. It was Maya. She was standing there, her face pale, her eyes red. She had watched her father be tackled, handcuffed, and dragged away like a common criminal. It was a trauma, yes. But as I looked at her, I saw something else. I saw relief. She looked at the door where Grant had vanished. Then she looked at me. There was a new respect in her eyes. She had seen the monster, and she had seen the dragon slayer. "Mom," she whispered. "I am here," I said. She threw her arms around me. It was not the polite hug of a daughter posing for a photo. It was a desperate cling. She buried her face in my shoulder, shaking. I wrapped my arms around her, stroking her hair. I felt the tension leaving her body. She was safe. The threat was neutralized. "Is it over?" she asked into my shoulder. "Yes," I replied, kissing the top of her head. "The bad part is over. Now the work begins." I held her for another moment, letting the guests see this image, the protective mother, the survivor. Then, I gently pulled away. I needed to finish the performance. I smoothed my dress. I picked up my wine glass from the table where I had set it down. It was still half full. I turned to face the room. The guests were shell-shocked. They were standing by their tables, unsure if they should leave, applaud, or call their therapists. The waiters were freezing in place, holding trays of appetizers that no one would eat. I tapped my glass with my fingernail. The sharp ting sound cut through the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady and gracious, as if I were merely apologizing for a spilled drink rather than a federal raid. "I must apologize for the interruption. It seems my husband had a prior engagement with the Department of Justice that he forgot to mention." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Good. They were relaxing. They were looking to me for cues on how to react. "However," I continued, raising my chin, "tonight is not about Grant Sterling. It never was. Tonight is about Maya, and it is about the future of Etheria Dynamics." I looked at the projection screen, which was now blank. "For 20 years, you have known a face," I said, "but the mind of the company has always been elsewhere. Effective immediately, I will be assuming the role of interim CEO. The glitch in our leadership has been removed. The source code is safe, the company is solvent, and the open bar is still open for another 2 hours." I raised my glass. "To Maya, and to the truth." There was a hesitation, a beat of silence where the crowd weighed their options. They looked at the door where the police had gone. They looked at me, standing in the wreckage of my marriage, looking stronger than I had ever looked in my life. Then, Senator Miller picked up his glass. "To Maya," he boomed. "To Maya," another voice joined in. "To the truth." One by one, the glasses went up, the tension broke, the chatter resumed, louder and more frantic than before. As everyone rushed to gossip about the scandal of the decade, the music started playing again. I took a sip of wine. It tasted like victory. The chaos had been absolute, but it had been entirely mine. I looked down at the table where Grant had sat. His chair was empty. His plate was broken. I signaled Marcus. "Clean that up," I said, gesturing to the mess. "We have dessert to serve." The days following the explosion at the Gilded Cage were not characterized by silence, but by a deafening, chaotic roar. If you have never been at the center of a national media firestorm, it is difficult to describe the physical sensation of it. It feels as though the air itself has turned into static electricity. The sidewalk outside my home in Beacon Hill was transformed into a campsite for satellite trucks and reporters hungry for the image of the weeping, discarded wife. But they never got that photo. I had anticipated the circus. In fact, I had hired the ringmaster. 2 weeks before the arrest, I had retained a crisis management firm known for their aggressive tactics. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning, the narrative had already been written, printed, and distributed to every major news outlet in the country. The story was not about a marriage falling apart. It was about a corporate heroine saving a legacy institution from the greed of a corrupt executive. The headlines did not read, "Wife of CEO dumped at party." They read, "Whistleblower co-founder stops $400 million embezzlement scheme." I did not hide behind the curtains. On Monday morning, wearing a white suit that cost $5,000 and looked like armor, I walked out onto my front steps. I gave a brief statement, thanking the FBI for their diligence and assuring the shareholders that Etheria Dynamics was in safe hands. I controlled the optics with the same precision I used to control the code. The legal dismantling of Grant Sterling was surgical. My lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, was having the time of his life. He told me later that in his 50 years of practicing law, he had never seen a prosecution case so perfectly gift-wrapped. Usually, white-collar crime is messy. It is buried in gray areas and plausible deniability, but I had given them high-definition video of the conspiracy and biometric logs of the theft. Grant's high-priced defense team quit within 48 hours when they realized their retainer had been paid from frozen accounts. He was assigned a public defender, a tired man who took one look at the mountain of evidence and told Grant to start praying for a plea deal. The charges were stacking up like bricks in a wall that would seal him away forever. Wire fraud, insider trading, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud shareholders. The federal prosecutors were talking about a sentence of 20 years, minimum, and then there was Vanessa. Vanessa Clay was a survivor. I will give her that. She possessed the moral flexibility of an invertebrate. The moment the handcuffs clicked shut, her loyalty to Grant evaporated faster than mist in a desert. She cut a deal with the district attorney before her mascara had even dried. In exchange for a reduced sentence, 18 months in a minimum security facility, she agreed to testify against Grant and, more importantly, to guide us to the bodies. She sat in an interrogation room and drew a map of Grant's financial hiding spots. She revealed the location of the cryptocurrency keys, the shell accounts in the Seychelles, and the safe deposit box in Zurich, where Grant had stashed diamonds bought with company funds. Because of her testimony, I was able to initiate clawback procedures immediately. We recovered nearly 90% of the stolen capital within 10 days. But the real battle was not in the courtroom, it was in the boardroom. On Wednesday, I walked into the headquarters of Etheria Dynamics for the first time in 15 years. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Henry who had been there since the beginning, saluted me. He knew, everyone knew. I took the elevator to the top floor. The boardroom was filled with 12 men in gray suits, the board of directors. These were men who had eaten steak dinners with Grant. who had laughed at his jokes, and who had turned a blind eye to his extravagances as long as the stock price was high. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and skepticism. To them, I was still the housewife. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the table, the spot where Grant used to hold court. "Gentlemen," I said, placing my laptop on the mahogany surface, "we have a lot of work to do. Mrs. Sterling, the chairman, a man named Robert Vance, began in a patronizing tone. We appreciate you stepping in during this crisis, but we are already in talks with a search firm for a new CEO. We need someone with industry experience to calm the markets." I looked at him. I have more industry experience in my little finger than any candidate you will find on LinkedIn. Robert, and if you think I am here to hand over the keys to the kingdom I built, you are mistaken. You built, Robert scoffed. Grant was the mouth. I cut him off, my voice sharp as a whip. I am the brain. I connected my laptop to the main screen. You are all panicked because you think Grant tried to sell the core source code to the Kruger-Vance consortium. You think our intellectual property is compromised. You think we are vulnerable. I tapped a key. The screen filled with lines of complex code. This, I said, pointing to the screen, is the code Grant stole. It is what I call the mirror. It looks like the Genesis sequence. It acts like the Genesis sequence. But it is a hollow shell. I wrote it 3 months ago as a decoy. The real source code, the algorithm that actually powers our predictive modeling, has never left my private server, which is air-gapped and secured by biometric encryption that only I possess. The room went silent. The directors exchanged stunned glances. "You mean," Robert stammered, "the asset is safe." "The asset is pristine," I said. Kruger-Vance bought a digital paperweight. Etheria has lost nothing but a criminal CEO. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. However, the company has a rot that needs to be excised. I turned my gaze to the chief financial officer, a man named Peterson, who had been Grant's drinking buddy. "Mr. Peterson, you authorized the transfers to the consulting firms that did not exist. You either knew about the fraud or you were too incompetent to spot it. Either way, you are fired. Security will escort you out." Peterson's face turned white. "You cannot do that." "I answer to the board. I am the majority shareholder," I reminded him, my voice leaving no room for argument. "And as of this morning, I have successfully petitioned for an emergency restructuring. Pack your things." In the next hour, I fired 3 other executives who had enabled Grant's behavior. I did not raise my voice. I did not lose my temper. I simply cut the dead weight with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing gangrene. By the time I left the meeting, I was no longer Brenda the wife. I was the Iron Lady of Etheria. The stock price, which had plummeted on the news of the arrest, rallied 12% by the closing bell. The market loves a strong leader, and I had just shown them teeth. Amidst the corporate bloodshed, there was a quieter, more important healing taking place. Maya was preparing for college. The trauma of the party had shaken her, but it had also matured her. She no longer looked at the world with the naive eyes of a child. She saw the mechanics of power now. We sat in her room, packing boxes for her move to Stanford. She held up a framed photo of her and Grant from a ski trip years ago. She looked at it for a long time, then placed it face down in the trash bin. "Mom," she said, "what happened to the money? The money he tried to steal for her. The $450 million from the fake sale never existed," I explained, "but the $50 million in debt he assumed that is being liquidated from his personal assets. However, I did find a separate account, $2 million he had set aside for a penthouse deposit." I handed her a folder. I seized it, and I repurposed it. Maya opened the folder. It was the paperwork for a new charitable foundation, the Maya Sterling Initiative for Women in Technology, she read aloud. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "He wanted to use that money to destroy our family," I said softly. "I thought it would be poetic to use it to build a future for girls like you. Girls who will be the architects, not just the wives. Maya hugged me then, burying her face in my neck. I love you. Mom, you are a badass. Language, I scolded gently, but I was smiling. 2 weeks later, I made the trip that I had been dreading, yet craving. The Suffolk County Jail was a stark contrast to the velvet and mahogany world Grant was used to. It smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. I sat on a metal stool on the visitor's side of the thick plexiglass partition when the guard brought Grant out. I almost didn't recognize him. It had only been a month, but he had aged 10 years. His hair, usually dyed and coiffed, was gray at the roots and greasy. His skin was sallow. He had lost weight, his expensive suit replaced by a baggy orange jumpsuit that washed him out. He looked small. He looked like a man whose soul had been extracted. He sat down, picking up the phone receiver with a trembling hand. I picked up mine. "Brenda," he croaked. His voice was raspy. "Brenda, thank God you came." I did not say anything. I just looked at him. "You have to help me," he began, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "This public defender is an idiot. He wants me to plead guilty to everything. 20 years. Brenda, I will die in here. You can't let that happen. We were partners. We built this life together." He leaned closer to the glass, his eyes wet with tears. "Remember the apartment on 4th Street? Remember when we had nothing? I am still that guy. Bren, I got lost. I made a mistake. Please, get me a real lawyer. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will sign everything over to you. I will disappear. Just don't let me die in a cage." He was trying to play the nostalgia card. He was trying to summon the ghost of the man I had once loved. But I looked at him and felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Just the clinical detachment of looking at a specimen in a jar. "You are right, Grant," I said, my voice calm and even through the receiver. "We did build a life together, and you tried to burn it down for an insurance payout." I was confused, he pleaded. Vanessa manipulated me. She twisted my head. "Stop," I said. It was a command. He fell silent, his lip quivering. "I did not come here to negotiate. Grant, I came here to give you something. Closure." I reached into my purse. I pulled out a single piece of paper. It was a high-resolution screenshot I had printed from his cloud backup. I pressed it against the glass. Grant looked at it. His eyes squinted, then widened in horror. It was a text message thread from 6 months ago. Before the investigation began, before I knew anything. Grant to Vanessa. "How much longer do I have to play the doting husband? She is suffocating me." Vanessa to Grant. "Just until the IPO. Baby, then we are free." Grant to Vanessa. "I honestly hope the old hag dies of a stroke or something soon. It would make the division of assets so much easier. I am sick of looking at her face." Grant stared at the words. He stared at the date stamp. He could not deny it. It wasn't about confusion. It wasn't about being lost. It was about malice. He had wished me dead for convenience. He looked up at me, his face crumbling. The mask of the victim slipped, revealing the shame of a man who has been stripped naked. "Brenda," he whispered. I did not respond. I folded the paper and put it back in my bag. I hung up the phone. Grant started slamming his hand against the glass. "Brenda, don't go. Brenda, I am sorry. Please." I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I turned my back on the man I had spent 20 years protecting. I walked toward the heavy steel door. I could hear him screaming my name, a muffled, desperate sound that faded with every step I took. The guard buzzed the door open. I stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the Boston afternoon. I took a deep breath. The air tasted like exhaust fumes and city grit. But to me, it was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. It tasted like freedom. The wheels of justice are usually square. They turn slowly, bumping and grinding against the pavement of bureaucracy. But when you grease the axles with high-definition video evidence, biometric logs, and a co-conspirator singing like a canary in exchange for a plea deal, Those wheels become round, smooth, and terrifyingly fast. The trial of Grant Sterling did not last for months. It did not even last for weeks. It was a 3-day event that felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a mandatory funeral for a man who was still breathing. 1 month after the chaos at the Gilded Cage, I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse in downtown Boston. I wore a suit of charcoal gray wool, severe and unapproachable. Beside me sat Arthur Pendleton, my lawyer, who was humming a tune under his breath, looking like a cat who had just been locked in a dairy. Vanessa Clay took the stand on the first day. The prosecution did not even have to push her. She was so terrified of prison that she vomited verbal evidence onto the court record. She detailed every meeting, every email, every fraudulent transfer. She painted Grant not as a mastermind, but as a desperate, greedy man who had bullied her into compliance. It was a lie she was just as greedy, but it was a lie that served my purpose. She threw him to the wolves to save her own skin. And I watched Grant's face as she did it. He did not look angry anymore. He looked hollow. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the loyalty bought with stolen money expires the moment the check bounces. The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a mechanic from South Boston who looked like he had no patience for men in Italian suits stealing pension funds, read the verdict, guilty, on all counts. The judge, a woman with eyes like flint, who had been reviewing the financial forensic reports for a week, looked over her reading glasses at Grant. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice echoing in the wood-paneled room. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen crimes of passion, crimes of necessity, and crimes of ignorance, but your actions represent a crime of pure, unadulterated hubris. You attempted to dismantle a company that employs thousands, defraud your shareholders, and destroy your own family, all to finance a lifestyle you did not earn." She paused, letting the weight of the room settle on his shoulders. "I am sentencing you to the maximum penalty allowed under the federal guidelines, 25 years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate forfeiture of all personal assets to satisfy the restitution order. You leave this courtroom with nothing but the clothes on your back." Grant did not scream. He did not cry. He simply slumped forward, his forehead touching the defense table. It was the posture of a man whose spine had been removed. As the bailiffs moved in to shackle him, he turned his head and looked at me one last time. There was no hatred left in his eyes, only a profound, bewildered question. How I did not answer him. I simply stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the courtroom. In the hallway, Arthur Pendleton was beaming. He packed his briefcase with the satisfaction of a craftsman. "Remarkable," Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "Simply remarkable, Brenda. You know, we were lucky. If you had caught him a few months earlier, or if he had stopped at the embezzlement, he might have gotten away with 5 years, maybe out in 3 for good behavior. But because we caught him right as he triggered the RICO predicate, the international wire fraud, and the conspiracy, he got the hammer." He looked at me with admiration. "It is a good thing you found that first discrepancy in the accounts 6 months ago, just in time." I stopped walking. I turned to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline where the glass towers of the financial district gleamed in the sun. "Arthur," I said quietly, "I did not find the discrepancy 6 months ago." Arthur stopped. He frowned, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "I beg your pardon. The timeline in the discovery documents." "The documents show when I chose to act," I corrected him. "I found the first packet leak 2 years ago." Arthur went still. The air around us seemed to cool. 2 years. "But, Brenda, if you knew 2 years ago, the fraud was minor then. He had only stolen maybe 100,000. You could have stopped him. You could have divorced him then." I turned my gaze from the window to the old lawyer. If I had divorced him 2 years ago, Arthur, he would have gotten half. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. He would have walked away with $50 million of my hard work. He would have fought me for custody of Maya. He would have started a rival company and spent the rest of his life tormenting me. I took a step closer to him. I did not want to stop him. Arthur. I wanted to finish him. Arthur stared at me. He was a man who had seen everything in the legal world. But in that moment, he looked slightly afraid. I let him do it, I continued, my voice devoid of emotion. I watched him set up the accounts. I watched him make the contacts with Vanessa. I watched him dig the hole. And every time he put down the shovel, I made it easier for him to pick it up again. I needed the amount to cross the federal threshold for aggravated white-collar crime. I needed him to commit wire fraud. I needed the sentence to be mandatory. "You fattened the pig," Arthur whispered, using an old mob term. "I fattened the pig," I agreed, because I needed to make sure that when the slaughter happened, there was no chance of resurrection. He is 45 years old. Arthur, in 25 years, he will be 70. He will be an old, broken man with no money, no connections, and no name. Maya will be a grown woman who barely remembers him. That is safety. That is absolute victory. Arthur looked at me for a long moment. Then, a slow, terrified respect dawned on his face. He tipped his hat. "Remind me never to cross you. Mrs. Sterling." "It is Ms. Hightower," I corrected him. "Sterling is a dead name." The next week was a blur of administrative violence. I did not just clean house at the company. I fumigated it. I convened a special meeting of the shareholders at the Four Seasons. I walked onto the stage not as the interim placeholder, but as the conquering queen. The stock was up, the confidence was high, but the name Etheria Dynamics still carried the stench of Grant's scandal. It was the name he had chosen. It had to go. "We are not the company we were yesterday," I told the assembly, my voice amplified through the hall. "We have survived a fire, and what rises from the fire is stronger, purer, and more dangerous than what burned." I clicked the remote. The screen behind me changed. The blue and silver logo of Etheria dissolved, replaced by a stylized, fierce bird rising from flames, rendered in gold and crimson. "Welcome to Phoenix Dynamics," I announced. A murmur went through the crowd. They thought it was just a cool name. Only I knew the irony. I had named the real company after the fake shell company I had used to trap Grant. I was wearing the weapon that killed him as a badge of honor. It was a private joke, a permanent reminder that the trap is only dangerous if you do not know you are the one setting it. Finally, the dust settled. 1 month after the trial, on a crisp Saturday evening, the water of Boston Harbor was the color of crushed sapphires. I sat on the aft deck of the Nemesis, a 100-foot yacht I had purchased not with company funds, but with the dividends of my own patents. The wind was cool, biting with the salt spray, but wrapped in a cashmere blanket. I felt nothing but warmth. Maya sat across from me. She was 18, but she looked older now. The baby fat had melted from her cheeks, revealing the high cheekbones that mirrored my own. She was holding a flute of sparkling cider, looking back at the city skyline retreating in our wake. She had been quiet for an hour. I knew she was processing. It is one thing to hate your father. It is another to watch your mother systematically dismantle his existence. "Mom," she asked, her voice carrying over the hum of the engines. "Yes, honey. Do you ever feel bad?" She turned to look at me. "I mean, 25 years. He is going to be an old man when he gets out. You took everything, the money, the house, the reputation. It was total warfare." She hesitated, then asked the real question. "Do you ever regret being that ruthless?" I put down my glass of champagne. I looked at the horizon, where the sun was bleeding into the ocean, turning the sky a violent, beautiful purple. I thought about the 20 years I had spent in the shadows. I thought about the way Grant used to interrupt me at dinner parties. I thought about the restructuring documents he had tried to make me sign that would have left us homeless. I thought about the text message where he wished for my death. "Maya," I said, turning to face her, "look at the ocean. It is beautiful, isn't it? But it is also indifferent. If you fall in and you cannot swim, it will drown you without a second thought." I reached across the small table and took her hand. The world is like that ocean. People like your father. They mistake kindness for weakness. They think that because you are quiet, you are defenseless. They think that because you love them, you will let them hold the knife. I squeezed her hand. To survive, you do not have to be cruel, but you have to be capable of cruelty. There is a difference. If you are not the one holding the knife, you are the meat on the cutting board. I did not want to be the butcher, Maya. But when he tried to put my head on the block, I had to show him that I owned the slaughterhouse. Maya looked at me, her eyes searching mine. She saw the hardness there. Yes, but she also saw the fierce, unyielding protection of a mother wolf. I taught him the final lesson, I said softly. The one he forgot: never, ever anger the person who holds the keys to the safe, and more importantly, never anger the person who holds the keys to your heart, because they know exactly where to twist the knife to make it fatal. Maya nodded slowly. She squeezed my hand back. I think I want to major in computer science, she said, a small smile touching her lips. And maybe pre-law, I laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound that felt light in my chest. That sounds like a dangerous combination. I love it. I leaned back, closing my eyes, feeling the vibration of the yacht cutting through the waves. The city was behind us. The past was behind us. Grant was in a cell 6 feet by 8 feet, staring at a concrete wall, and I was here. I was not Brenda the wife. I was not Brenda the victim. I was Brenda Hightower, CEO of Phoenix Dynamics, the architect of my own salvation. I had burned my life to the ground, and from the ashes, I had built a throne. The yacht turned, heading for the open sea. I opened my eyes and watched the wake churn white against the blue. It was a clean line, a straight path, and for the first time in 20 years, the course was entirely mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Brenda and her calculated revenge. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening while driving, cooking, or relaxing at home? Please leave a comment below and let me know your location and your thoughts on Brenda's final move. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, Sweet Rose Drama, hit the like button on this video, and smash that hype button to help this story get recommended to more people. Your support means the world to us and helps us create more dramatic, emotional stories for you. See you in the next video.